Hi everyone, Lee Packett here, and we're joined today by Steve Drucker via Skype. He's an attorney, activist, and author of a recently published book, Altered Genes, Twisted Truth: How the Venture to Genetically Engineer Our Food Has Subverted Science, Corrupted Government, and Systemically Deceived the Public. We're happy to have him with us. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much for having me talking with you today.
My pleasure. So your work in this area, I'm told, started off with a lawsuit many years ago. Could you take us through it?
Yes, as I learned more about the massive venture to reconfigure the genetic core of the world's food supply, I became very concerned. And the more I learned, the greater my concern became. I eventually decided there should be a lawsuit challenging the FDA because it was allowing genetically engineered foods into our food supply uh, under a presumption that they are generally recognized as safe, not on the basis of any solid evidence, not on the basis of a overwhelming scientific consensus, which it claimed, but I knew that there were many scientists who disagreed. And I filed a lawsuit. I organized a lawsuit. There were several plaintiffs that joined, among them 9 well-credentialed life scientists. That was unprecedented for a group of well-credentialed scientists to be suing a federal administrative agency on the grounds that one of its policies is scientifically unsound. Very quickly in the lawsuit, the FDA was forced to hand over 44,000 pages of its internal files relevant to the policy it had made on genetically engineered foods. And in going through that trove of documents, I discovered uh, substantial evidence, startling evidence, that the FDA had been lying to the world since 1992 and that it had been breaking the law because what the FDA files indicated was opposite to what the FDA has been claiming in public.
So let's take us up to present day here. You decided to write this really interesting book on the topic. Why did you do so?
Well, I wrote it because uh, the revelations in the FDA's files were made public by me at a major press conference in Washington, D.C. in 1999. And yet, the mainstream media in the United States has suppressed that evidence, clear-cut evidence that the FDA scientists were warning about the risks repeatedly and that their superiors had suppressed their warnings and had lied in public and stated they had no information showing that genetically engineered foods differ in any meaningful or uniform way from other foods, when in fact they had extensive evidence and extensive information from their own scientists warning them that genetic engineering is different than conventional breeding, that the foods it produces entail different risks, that each one of them has to undergo stringent safety testing, which, by the way, is what the law requires anyway. And the FDA covered, as I said, covered up those warnings, lied about it, broke the law, said that there was an overwhelming consensus in the scientific community that these foods are safe, that they don't need to be tested at all. And they were let on the market in the US on the basis of no testing, and there is currently no requirement for testing from the FDA.
Mm-hmm.
One of the biggest frauds in the history of the United States government. It continues today, and most people are completely unaware of it. And I wanted to write the book not only to expose that fraud, but to expose the many frauds that have gone along with that, that have been needed in order to allow the genetically engineered food venture to continue and succeed as it has done. Because the book documents, not only the FDA has been twisting the truth, but many eminent scientists and scientific institutions have been as well. And that's a very important point. Most people think the only evil player is Monsanto or maybe some of the other major multinational corporations that produce these foods. But as my book demonstrates, the main culprits are the FDA and some other government regulators, other agencies in our country and in other nations, and primarily the scientific establishment.
Mm-hmm.
Because without the deceptions, and deception, I use that word quite consciously and conservatively, without the deceptions of the mainstream scientific establishment for over 20 years. Monsanto, DuPont, and the other major biotech firms could not have done what they've done, nor could the FDA. So that's why the subtitle of the book emphasizes the subversion of science, then the corruption of government, because it was the scientific establishment, as the book demonstrates, that actually corrupted government,
Right.
not the biotech industry. The corruption began before there was a biotech industry.
Right, but Steve, a skeptic here would say that in one sense, the horse has already left the barn. What would you like to see done going forward with respect to these products being on the market? Do you want them taken off?
Well, I think it's quite legitimate, and as the book demonstrates, it's quite conservative to take them all off the market, because that would merely be bringing reality into line with the law. Every one of these genetically engineered foods is on the US market illegally. And when a food is on the market illegally, you don't say, well, it's there, we'll just let it go. We wouldn't do that. We don't do that in the case of pharmaceutical drugs if we learned that there were irregularities and that there were risks that were not adequately tested for and that the law had been broken. Every one of these foods has to be recalled. Labeling at this point is far too meek a remedy. If a food is on the market illegally, and if we know, according to the FDA's own scientists, that these foods entail unique risks, and we also know that many other scientists and scientific organizations have said the same thing. So we know that there's not a consensus about safety within the scientific community, a consensus that is required by law before such foods are on the market. We take them off. We don't just label them, we take them off the market, and we make sure that none of them gets back on the market unless and until it has gone through the rigorous safety testing that is required by law and also required as a matter of sound biological science.
Mm. Steve, this is a fascinating issue for me because it's an example of a trend that's been, in my view, accelerating over time in this country and in other countries around the world. It's all about corporations exerting undue influence over public institutions. Do you think we will see a day where this trend begins to reverse in American government?
I certainly hope so, and my book could be a major stimulus. There are other books that have been. Another book came out recently on the completely irresponsible behavior of the Environmental Protection Agency when it comes to regulation of pesticides. It's called Poison Spring, and when the evidence comes out, when the truth really begins to be told and revealed, I think people are going to demand a major reform because it really has gone far too long. And the American public has been subjected to the risks of genetically engineered foods since 1993. That's when the first genetically engineered whole food hit the market. That's far too long. There's a whole generation of new Americans that have grown up consuming these foods. Many of them actually were consuming them while they were in the womb, through the umbilical cord. And we have no evidence demonstrating that these foods are safe, and is substantial evidence demonstrating that many of them have proven harmful to laboratory animals, and that every one of them should be presumed unsafe until demonstrated safe. And that, after all, is what the law requires. Every one of these foods is, by law, presumed unsafe until demonstrated safe. And not a single one has been demonstrated safe according to the adequate scientific or legal standards at this point.
Steve, we were talking before about how some other countries and groups around the world handle issues like these. Can you talk to us a little bit about where the EU is on these issues, at least with respect to comparing and contrasting with U.S. law?
Well, the fascinating thing, Lee, is that the EU does have in practice a somewhat stronger policy on GMOs than does the United States. But I have to emphasize that's only as a matter of practice. What most people are amazed to learn is that as a matter of law, the United States has far stricter laws when it comes to GMOs than does the EU, or really, as far as I know, any other nation. Our food safety laws are very strong when it comes to foods containing new additives, such as these new genetically engineered products. And that's been the case since 1958, when the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act was amended to presume that all additives added to food that didn't have a safe history of use before 1958 were presumed unsafe and had to be proven safe before they could be on the market. Now, in Europe, it's a much looser standard when it comes to GMOs. According to the law, GMOs should have been subjected to far stricter safety testing here than they have been required to undergo in the EU or any other country of which I'm aware. So that is the irony, that we are the country where the market has been permeated with GMOs since 1993. They're not even labeled here. In the EU, there is some testing. It's inadequate, but at least there's some testing. And as my book, though, does demonstrate, it's woefully deficient. But at least the foods there have to be labeled. And that's one reason that there are very few GMOs, if any, that have made their way directly into the human food supply in the European Union. It's because there's been labeling, and also the European media back in the early days did fairly report the scientific controversy and the fact that there was not a scientific consensus about safety, the fact that many eminent scientists had raised warnings, and the fact that several research studies had cast serious doubts on the safety. So the European public made it clear they didn't want to eat these foods. The foods became labeled, and that's why one can go into a convenience store or a fast food restaurant in almost any country in the European Union and be exposed to almost zero genetically engineered foods. Whereas in the United States, one can walk the aisles of even health food stores and find many, many products that contain GMOs.
Fascinating stuff. Steve Drucker, thank you very much for talking to us today.
Well, thank you very much, Lee.
That's what we have for the week. If you'd like to see more of the stuff that we're working on, be sure to go check us out online. You can find us at MimesisWebTV.com. You can also find us on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. I'm Lee Packia. Thanks for watching.